What would you do if a violent, towering drunk attacked a terrified child in the middle of a crowded, high-end restaurant? Vivian stepped in, but she didn't know the boy belonged to New York's most ruthless mafia boss, and she definitely didn't know the drunk was a hired killer. The rain in Manhattan fell in heavy, relentless sheets, beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Petit Diamant, a Michelin-starred restaurant that catered to the city's elite. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white truffles, expensive Cabernet, and old money. Vivian Harper wiped a stray strand of dark hair from her forehead, adjusting her starched white apron. It was her third double shift of the week. At 26, she was exhausted, surviving on black coffee and the desperate need to pay off the crushing medical debt left behind by her late mother. She was balancing a silver tray with 3 glasses of perfectly chilled Dom Perignon when she noticed the boy. He couldn't have been older than 7. He sat alone at corner booth number 4, the most secluded and expensive table in the house. He wore a tiny, impeccably tailored navy suit, his dark hair neatly parted, but his small hands gripped a tablet tightly, his eyes wide and anxious. He had been alone for 10 minutes. The man who had brought him in, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who looked more like a heavy hitter than a father, had stepped out to take a phone call in the alley. Vivian frowned. It wasn't her section, but her instincts flared. A child alone in a restaurant full of ruthless power brokers never sat right with her. Before she could walk over to offer him a glass of water, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open. The wind howled into the dining room, followed by a man. He was massive, wearing a soaking wet trench coat, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He staggered forward, knocking into a waiter and sending a tray of oysters crashing to the marble floor. "Hey, watch it!" a patron yelled. The man ignored the chaos he was causing. He wasn't looking at the bar, and he wasn't looking for a table. His bloodshot eyes locked dead onto corner booth number 4, onto the little boy. Vivian felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Growing up in the foster system of South Boston had given her a 6th sense for violence. The way this man moved, despite the exaggerated stagger, was too purposeful. His right hand was buried deep in his trench coat pocket. "Where is he?" the man slurred loudly, though his gaze never left the boy. "Where's the boss?" The little boy dropped his tablet, his face going completely pale. He shrank back against the velvet cushions, his small chest heaving. The man lunged. He moved with a sudden, terrifying speed that completely dropped the drunken facade. He reached into his coat, pulling out a heavy steel object. Vivian didn't think. The tray of champagne slipped from her fingers, the crystal shattering against the floor in a symphony of chaos. She sprinted across the dining room. "Hey!" Vivian screamed, throwing her entire body weight between the towering man and the terrified child. The man crashed into her. The impact felt like getting hit by a freight train. Vivian was thrown backward, her ribs colliding painfully with the edge of the mahogany table. But she didn't fall. She grabbed a heavy, serrated steak knife left behind on a nearby table. "Move, bitch!" the man snarled, his breath smelling heavily of cheap whiskey and metallic copper. He raised his hand, gripping a suppressed tactical pistol. This was no drunk. This was an assassination attempt. "Get under the table!" Vivian screamed at the boy. Little Leo scrambled beneath the velvet booth, crying out. The hitman aimed the gun at Vivian's chest. In a split second of pure adrenaline, Vivian lunged forward rather than backing away. She slammed her left hand upward, striking his wrist and redirecting the barrel of the gun just as a quiet foot sounded. The bullet shattered the restaurant window. With her right hand, she drove the handle of the heavy steak knife, not the blade, but the solid silver pommel, directly into the man's temple. He staggered, stunned, dropping the gun. Vivian kicked it away, wrapping her arms around the man's neck and using his own momentum to slam him headfirst into the marble pillar beside the booth. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The dining room erupted into absolute hysteria. Women screamed, men ducked under tables, and security guards finally began rushing into the room. Vivian stood there, panting, her hands shaking violently. Blood was dripping from a shallow cut on her cheek where flying glass had grazed her, staining her crisp white collar. She immediately dropped to her knees, looking under the table. "Hey," she whispered, her voice trembling but soft. "Hey, it's okay. He's gone. Are you hurt?" The little boy crawled out, his dark eyes wide with shock. Without a word, he threw his arms around Vivian's neck, burying his face in her shoulder, sobbing quietly. She hugged him back tightly, resting her chin on his head. "Nobody touches the boy," a voice echoed through the chaotic room. The screaming in the restaurant stopped instantly. It was as if the temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. Vivian looked up. Standing by the shattered window was a man who seemed to swallow the light around him. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal three-piece suit. His face was chiseled from marble, his jaw sharp, and his eyes the exact same piercing, icy blue as the little boys were locked entirely on Vivian. This was Damien Russo, the head of the Russo crime syndicate, and the father of the boy she was currently holding. 3 massive men in tailored suits flooded the room behind Damien. One of them immediately grabbed the unconscious hitman by his collar, dragging him toward the kitchen doors like a sack of garbage. The restaurant manager was practically weeping in the corner, too terrified to speak. Damien slowly walked toward corner booth, number 4. Every step he took was calculated, silent, and deadly. He stopped 2 feet away from Vivienne, who was still kneeling on the floor, clutching his son. "Leo," Damien said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. It wasn't a yell, but it commanded absolute obedience. The little boy peeked out from Vivienne's shoulder, sniffled, and reluctantly let go of her, running to his father. Damien dropped to one knee, checking the boy over with frantic, heavy hands. When he realized Leo was completely unharmed, a terrifying tension seemed to release from his broad shoulders. Damien stood back up, towering over Vivienne. He looked down at her. He took in the shattered glass, the knocked-over table, the steak knife on the floor, and the blood steadily dripping from her cheek. "What is your name?" Damien asked, his icy blue eyes analyzing her like a threat. "Vivienne," she breathed out, slowly standing up. Her ribs screamed in agony. "Vivienne Harper." "You intervened," Damien stated, looking at the pool of blood where the hitman had hit his head. "He had a gun, a suppressed Heckler and Coke. You brought a steak knife to a gunfight, Miss Harper. He was going to shoot a child," Vivienne snapped, her adrenaline overriding her common sense. "I didn't exactly have time to check his artillery. Where the hell were your security guards?" "Your kid was sitting here alone." A sharp collective gasp echoed from the surviving waitstaff hiding behind the bar. "You didn't yell at Damien Russo. You barely breathed in his direction." Damien's men stepped forward, hands reaching into their jackets. But Damien raised a single, gloved finger. They froze. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of Damien's mouth. "My head of security stepped out for a phone call. He is currently bleeding out in the alleyway. The man you put down was a professional cleaner sent by the Costello family." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of expensive bergamot and gun oil washed over her. "You saved my son's life, Vivienne Harper. The Russo family does not leave debts unpaid." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum money clip. He peeled off a stack of $100 bills. It had to be at least $10,000 and held it out to her. Vivienne stared at the money. A hot flash of anger bubbled in her chest. She had just risked her life, cracked her ribs, and almost taken a bullet to the chest. And he was treating her like a valet, who had parked his car nicely. "Keep your blood money," Vivienne said, her voice shaking with rage. She pushed his hand away. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for him." She looked at Leo, gave him a small, sad smile, and began to uncross the ties of her apron. "I'm going home. I quit." She threw her apron on the ruined table and pushed past Damien's men, walking toward the exit. "Miss Harper," Damien called out. Vivienne ignored him, pushing through the heavy oak doors into the freezing Manhattan rain. She made it exactly half a block before her adrenaline crashed. Her knees buckled. The pain in her ribs flared so brightly she saw white spots. She stumbled against a brick alleyway wall, sliding down into the cold puddles, clutching her side. A sleek, bulletproof black Maybach pulled up to the curb in front of her. The back door opened, and Damien Russo stepped out into the rain. He held a large black umbrella, sheltering them both. "You have 2 cracked ribs. You're bleeding from the face, and you are in shock," Damien said calmly, looking down at her. "Get in the car." "Go to hell," Vivienne spat out, shivering violently. "The man you assaulted in my restaurant is not a lone wolf," He belongs to a network. By tomorrow morning, they will know a waitress interfered with the hit. They will pull the security footage. They will find out who you are, Vivienne. And they will come to your cramped, second-floor apartment in Queens to finish the job. Vivienne froze. Her breath hitched. How? How do you know where I live? I know everything, Damien said, extending a large, scarred hand toward her. You have two choices. You can sit in this alley and wait for the Costellos to find you. Or you can get in this car. I need someone to watch my son. Someone who isn't afraid to put themselves between him and a bullet. You work for me now. Vivienne looked at his hand. She thought of her empty apartment, her piling bills, and the cold, terrifying reality of the Mafia men who would be hunting her by sunrise. Slowly, her trembling hand reached up and grabbed his. Damien pulled her to her feet effortlessly, guiding her into the warm, leather-scented back seat of the Maybach. As the car sped away into the dark city, Vivienne realized with a sinking heart that she hadn't just saved a little boy's life. She had just sold her soul to the devil of New York. And the worst part was, as she looked at Damien Russo sitting across from her in the dim light of the street lamps, she realized the devil was far more captivating than she ever could have imagined. The Russo estate was a fortress of glass and black steel perched on the cliffs of Westchester, overlooking the Hudson River. For Vivienne, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-end prison. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the restaurant. Her ribs were healing, thanks to the private surgeon Damien had summoned in the middle of the night, and her cheek bore only a faint, silvery scar. Her days were spent with Leo. The boy was a genius, quiet and observant, haunted by the memory of the mother he had lost to a car accident 3 years prior, an accident everyone in the house knew was a coordinated hit. Vivienne taught him how to bake messy chocolate chip cookies in the industrial kitchen, a stark contrast to the rigid, cold meals prepared by the staff. For the first time in years, the sound of a child's laughter echoed through the marble halls. Damien, however, was a ghost. He left before dawn and returned long after Leo was asleep. When they did cross paths, the tension was thick enough to choke on. He would watch her from the doorway, his tie loosened, a glass of amber scotch in his hand, his eyes tracking her every move with a predatory intensity that made her skin prickle. "You're teaching him to be soft," Damien said one evening, leaning against the doorframe of the library. Vivienne was showing Leo how to fold origami cranes. Vivienne didn't look up. "I'm teaching him to be a child, Damien. There's a difference. A child in my world doesn't have the luxury of being soft. My enemies look for kindness like a shark looks for blood." He stepped into the room, the scent of rain and expensive tobacco following him. Maybe if you spent less time making enemies and more time being a father, he wouldn't need to be so hard, Vivienne countered, finally meeting his gaze. Damien froze. His men usually trembled when he entered a room. This woman, who possessed nothing but a suitcase of thrift store clothes and a stubborn streak a mile wide, looked at him like he was just a man. He walked toward her, his presence looming. He reached out, his thumb grazing the scar on her cheek. "You have a dangerous tongue, Vivienne," he whispered, his voice dropping an octave. "Most people would be begging for their lives. You just keep pushing. What are you going to do? Fire me?" She challenged, her heart hammering against her ribs not from fear, but from the sudden, electric proximity of him. The moment was shattered by the frantic ringing of Damien's encrypted phone. He pulled away, his expression snapping back into a mask of cold iron. He listened for 10 seconds, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the device. "Secure the perimeter. Lock down Alpha," Damien barked into the phone. He looked at Vivienne, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. "Take Leo to the panic room. Now." "What's happening?" "The Costello family didn't just find your address, Vivienne. They found mine. We have a mole." Vivienne grabbed Leo, who was already pale and trembling. She didn't ask questions. She sprinted toward the hidden elevator behind the bookshelf. But as the doors began to slide shut, a deafening explosion rocked the mansion. The power cut out instantly, plunging the house into a terrifying, crimson-strobed emergency light. Vivienne felt the elevator jolt and get stuck. They were trapped between floors. Outside, the muffled sound of rapid gunfire erupted the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of submachine guns. Vivienne, I'm scared, Leo whispered, clinging to her waist. I know, baby, I know. Close your eyes and count to 100, she whispered, pulling him into the corner of the small lift. Suddenly, the top hatch of the elevator was wrenched open with a screech of shearing metal. Vivienne looked up, expecting to see Damien's hand reaching down to save them. Instead, she saw a face she recognized from the restaurant. It was the drunk hitman, the one she thought was in a Russo interrogation basement. He had a jagged scar across his temple where she had struck him, and his eyes were filled with a murderous, vengeful glee. Round 2, sweetheart, he hissed, dropping a flashbang grenade into the elevator. The world went white. When Vivienne's vision cleared, she was lying on the floor of the main foyer. Her head felt like it had been cracked open. She looked up to see Damien on his knees, his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood streaming down his face. 10 armed men in tactical gear surrounded him. Standing over Damien was a man she had never seen, Silas Costello, the rival Don, and he was holding a gun to Leo's head. A mole is such an ugly word, Damien, Silas laughed, his voice thin and reedy. I prefer to call it investment. Your own head of security gave us the codes, and he told us all about your new little distraction. Silas turned his gaze toward Vivienne. Damien lunged forward, despite his bindings, his roar of rage echoing through the house. A guard slammed a rifle butt into his kidneys, dropping him again. Leave her out of this, Silas, Damien choked out. She's a waitress, she's nothing. She's the woman who humiliated my best cleaner, Silas said, walking toward Vivienne. He grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to look at the carnage. And tonight, she's the woman who's going to watch you lose everything. Silas raised his weapon, aiming it at Leo. Wait! Vivienne screamed. Her voice wasn't high-pitched with terror. It was cold. Commandingly cold. Everyone paused. Even Damien looked up, squinting through the blood in his eyes. Vivienne stood up slowly. Her posture had changed. The frantic waitress was gone. She wiped the blood from her mouth and looked Silas Costello dead in the eye. You're making a very big mistake, Silas, she said quietly. You think I'm here because Damien found me? You think I'm just a lucky girl who worked a shift at the right time? She reached into the back of her waistband, not into her pocket, but into a hidden seam in her trousers, and pulled out a small, high-frequency transmitter she had been hiding for weeks. I wasn't protecting Leo from your hitman because I'm a hero, Vivienne said, her voice echoing with a chilling authority. I was protecting him because he's a material witness in a federal investigation, and you just walked into a kill zone. Damien's jaw dropped. Vivienne, what? My name isn't Vivienne Harper, she said, looking at Damien with a mix of regret and professional detachment. I'm Special Agent Sarah Vance with the Organized Crime Task Force. And Silas, look at the windows. Red laser dots suddenly painted every person in the room except for Vivienne and Leo. The massive glass walls of the foyer shattered inward as 3 tactical teams rappelled from the roof. The waitress didn't dive for cover. She lunged forward, swept Silas's legs out from under him with a textbook martial arts takedown, and disarmed him before he could pull the trigger. Within 60 seconds, the room was secured. The Costello men were on the ground in handcuffs. Vivienne stood over Silas, holding his own gun. She then turned toward Damien, who was still kneeling, his eyes wide with a betrayal deeper than any bullet wound could cause. The mole wasn't your security head, Damien, Vivienne said, her voice trembling slightly now. I leaked the coordinates. I needed Silas and his entire inner circle in one room to make the racketeering charges stick. I used you. I used your house. Damien looked at her, his heart shattering behind his ribs. And Leo? Did you use him too? Vivienne looked at the little boy, who was being shielded by a federal agent. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I did my job, Damien. But as she looked at the man she had spent 2 weeks falling for, the man she was now forced to put in handcuffs, she realized the shocking twist wasn't just her identity. It was the fact that she was willing to throw away her entire career to keep him from going to prison. The high-ceilinged foyer was a symphony of chaos. Blue and red lights pulsed against the marble walls, reflecting off the shattered glass that littered the floor like diamonds. Federal agents and FBI windbreakers were swarming the estate, tagging evidence and zip-tying the last of the Costello soldiers. Vivienne, now Agent Sarah Vance, stood in the center of it all, her service weapon holstered, her back straight. but her eyes were fixed on Damien. He hadn't moved. He sat on the floor, his face a mask of cold, agonizing clarity. "Get him up!" a sharp voice commanded. Special Agent in Charge Harrison Reed walked into the room, his shoes crunching on the glass. He was Vivian's handler, a man who had spent 20 years trying to dismantle the Russo Empire. He looked at Damien with a predatory smirk. "Damien Russo. I've waited a long time for this," Reed said. He turned to Vivian. "Excellent work, Vance. The Costello leak worked perfectly. We have the whole board in one sweep. Get the kid to social services for processing." The word social services hit Vivian like a physical blow. She looked at Leo, who was huddled in the corner of the sofa, his small face pale, his eyes darting between the armed men and the woman he thought was his protector. "No," Vivian said, her voice small but firm. Reed narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" "Leo stays. He's a minor. He has a legal guardian," Vivian said, stepping toward the boy. "His legal guardian is going to a federal holding cell." "Sarah, focus," Reed snapped. "The deal was simple. You get us the Costellos, and we take Russo down as collateral. Now move." Vivian looked at Damien. For the first time, the feared Mafia boss looked defeated not by the guns, but by her. "You told me you did it for him," Damien said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The night at the restaurant. You said you didn't do it for me, you did it for Leo. Was that part of the script, Agent Vance?" Vivian felt a tear finally escape, carving a path through the dust and blood on her cheek. No, that was the only part that was real. In that moment, Vivian saw something Reed didn't. She saw Silas Costello, who was being moved toward the exit, subtly nodding to one of his arrested men. The man wasn't wearing standard plastic ties. He had slipped them. He was reaching for a backup piece hidden in the hollowed-out heel of a fallen guard's boot. It was a suicide play. Silas knew he was going away for life. He wanted to take the King of New York with him. "Gun!" Vivian screamed. Time slowed down. The Costello soldier lunged, aiming directly at Damien's head. Vivian didn't draw her weapon. She didn't have time. She threw her body across Damien, shielding him just as she had shielded Leo 2 weeks prior. Pop, pop. 2 rounds flared. One caught Vivian in the shoulder, spinning her around. The second was silenced by Reed, who dropped the shooter with a perfect shot to the chest. Vivian slumped into Damien's lap. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had betrayed him was now bleeding for him. "Sarah! Vivian!" Damien roared, his bound hands struggling to hold her up. "Listen to me," Vivian wheezed, clutching Damien's shirt. "Reed, he's dirty. He didn't just want the Costellos. He's been on their payroll for years. He wanted you dead so Silas could take over the docks. That's why he pushed for the raid tonight." Damien's eyes went icy. He looked up at Reed, who was standing 5 feet away, his gun still drawn, his face twitching with a sudden, panicked realization that his cover was blown. "She's delirious," Reed stammered to the other agents. "Secure the perimeter." But Vivian reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. She had been recording her briefings with Reed for months. She pressed play. Reed's voice filled the room. "Once Russo is in the crosshairs, let the Costello boys finish it. We'll call it resisting arrest. Just make sure the girl stays out of the line of fire." The other FBI agents froze, their weapons slowly shifting from the suspects to their own commander. "Drop it, Reed," one of the junior agents commanded. Reed looked around, saw the walls closing in, and dropped his weapon. The betrayal was complete, but the roles had flipped. 3 hours later, the mansion was quiet. The feds had cleared out, taking Reed and the Costellos with them. Because of Vivian's testimony regarding Reed's corruption, the entire case against Damien was compromised, unraveled by the very mole they had planted. Damien sat on the edge of the terrace, watching the sunrise. His son was asleep upstairs, tucked in by the woman who had risked everything to save them twice. Vivian walked out, her arm in a sling, her face pale. She had her small suitcase in her hand. "You're leaving," Damien said. It wasn't a question. "I can't stay, Damien. I'm not an agent anymore. I turned in my badge, and I'm certainly not your waitress." Damien stood up and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was inches away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same stack of $100 bills from the restaurant. "I told you. The Russo family does not leave debts unpaid," he said. Vivienne went to push his hand away, but he caught her wrist. He flipped the money over. Tucked inside the rubber band wasn't just cash, it was a passport, a set of keys to a villa in Tuscany, and a small, gold ring. "I don't want a waitress," Damien whispered, his hand moving to the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his. "And I don't need an agent. I need the woman who was brave enough to lie to my face and then die for my life. Stay. Not for the job. For us." Vivienne looked at the keys, then at the man who had become her entire world in the span of a few violent weeks. She realized that sometimes, the biggest twist isn't the secret you keep, but the truth you're finally brave enough to live. She dropped the suitcase. "I guess I'm not going back to Queens," she whispered. Damien smiled, a real, genuine smile, and kissed her as the sun broke over the Hudson, finally burning away the shadows of their past. From a simple shift at a restaurant to the highest stakes in New York's underworld, Vivienne and Damien's story proves that love is the most dangerous game of all. Did you see that double cross coming? If you loved this roller coaster of a story, make sure to like this video and share it with your friends. Subscribe for more epic tales of romance and betrayal. What would you have done in Vivienne's shoes? Let us know in the comments.